He was the last king of a fallen empire, a prince who inherited nothing but ruins and despair. Yet, he rose from the ashes to become the man who defeated Genghis Khan's invincible army. This is the incredible story of Jalal Adin Mingburnu, the warrior prince who stared into the face of the Mongol storm and did not flinch. Jalal ad-Din was born in 1199 into the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the wealthiest and most powerful Islamic dynasties of its time. His father ruled a vast kingdom that stretched from modern-day Iran to Afghanistan, controlling the vital Silk Road trade routes. This empire was fabulously rich, but as Jalal ad-Din would learn, wealth can attract the wrong kind of attention. From a young age, Jalal ad-Din was different. While other princes enjoyed the luxuries of the court, he was obsessed with military strategy. He mastered the sword and the horse, but his true weapon was his mind. He studied military formations, siege warfare, and the art of battle. He understood that true power wasn't just about having a big army, it was about knowing how to use it. While his father and the court were distracted by internal politics, Jalal ad-Din saw a shadow growing in the east. He heard whispers of a new power. The Mongols, led by a fearsome warlord named Genghis Khan, most dismissed them as mere nomads, but Jalal ad-Din saw the truth. He studied their tactics, their discipline, and their relentless ambition. He knew they were a threat unlike any other. Little did anyone know, this young prince's foresight would soon be the only thing standing between his people and total annihilation. In 1220, the storm broke. Jalal ad-Din, now 21, watched in horror as Genghis Khan's massive army swept into his homeland. The Mongol invasion was a force of nature, destroying everything in its path. Cities were razed, and the mighty Khwarezmian Empire crumbled. His father, the great Shah, fled into exile, dying a broken man on a remote island. The world was ending, but for Jalal ad-Din, the fight was just beginning. Instead of running, he chose to stand. The Mongol invasion seemed unstoppable. Genghis Khan's forces were a perfectly organized war machine, ruthless and efficient, crushing entire civilizations. For most, resistance was unthinkable. But Jalal ad-Din was not like most people. With his empire in ruins and his father gone, he could have easily fled and saved himself. Many would have, but he refused to surrender. Instead, he took a monumental risk. He began to rally the survivors. From the scattered remnants of his father's army, he forged a new force. He used the connections he had built in his youth, calling on loyal soldiers, hardened mercenaries, and fierce Afghan tribesmen to join his cause. They gathered around this young prince, preparing for what looked like a suicide mission. His new army was a ragtag group. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. But they had something the Mongols could conquer, a deep knowledge of their homeland's treacherous terrain, and a brilliant commander. Jalal ad-Din knew he couldn't face the Mongols in a conventional head-on battle. That would be madness. So, he decided to fight smarter, not harder. He would use guerrilla tactics. By early 1221, he had assembled a force of around 60,000 men. These weren't palace guards. They were desperate fighters who had lost everything. Their motivation was raw survival, and under Jalal ad-Din's leadership, they became a deadly weapon. They trained to use the unforgiving mountains of Afghanistan as their greatest ally, mastering the art of the ambush and the surprise attack. The Mongols were masters of open-field warfare, but their cavalry was vulnerable in the rugged mountains where they couldn't maneuver. Jalal ad-Din was counting on this, and when the Mongol army marched into the Parwan Valley, they were about to walk straight into his trap. When the Mongol army entered the Parwan Valley in the spring of 1221, they expected another easy victory. Led by one of Genghis Khan's most trusted generals, their force of 30,000 elite warriors had left a trail of destruction across Asia. They were confident, arrogant, and completely unaware that Jalal ad-Din was waiting for them. He wasn't just preparing for a battle. He had engineered a masterpiece of military strategy. Jalal ad-Din knew his raw, newly formed army was no match for the Mongols in a fair fight. So, he decided to make the fight unfair. He used the very landscape of Parwan as a weapon. He strategically positioned his forces on the high ground, looking down upon the narrow valley. This single move neutralized the Mongols' greatest strength, their legendary cavalry. The Mongol horsemen, who could dominate any open plain, were now trapped in a confined space where their speed and maneuverability were useless. As the Mongol vanguard advanced into the valley, they immediately felt something was wrong. The steep, rocky terrain broke their disciplined formations, throwing them into confusion. Their horses struggled on the uneven ground, and the fearsome Mongol war machine began to stall. And that's when Jalal Adin unleashed hell. He didn't command from the safety of the rear. No, this 22-year-old prince, filled with a burning desire for vengeance and justice, personally led the charge. He galloped down the slopes, his sword raised, crashing directly into the heart of the Mongol lines. It was an act of unbelievable courage, a move that stunned the Mongol commanders. To them, he was just a boy, a defeated prince. But in that moment, he became their worst nightmare. The Battle of Parwan was unlike anything the Mongols had ever experienced. As they struggled to navigate the treacherous terrain, their greatest weapon, their cavalry, became their greatest weakness. The Mongol horsemen, so used to thundering across the steppes, found themselves bogged down, exposed, and vulnerable on the steep rocky slopes. This was the moment Jalal Adin had been waiting for. With the Mongol army disoriented and trapped, he signaled the main assault. Leading the charge himself, he plunged his army like a spear into the Mongol ranks. Imagine the scene, a young prince, vastly outnumbered, leading men who had lost everything, charging headfirst into the most feared army on earth. His personal bravery was a lightning rod for his troops. The psychological shock to the Mongols was immense. For the first time in their westward conquest, they weren't facing an enemy that fled in terror. They were facing an army that met their ferocity with equal fire, an army led by a king who fought like a common soldier. Inspired by their leader's incredible courage, Jalal ad-Din's men fought with the strength of 10. They overwhelmed the confused Mongol lines. What happened next was historic. The Mongols, whose very name was a synonym for victory, began to break. The most disciplined army in the world fell into chaos. The battle raged for hours. But as the sun began to set, the impossible became reality. The invincible Mongols were in full retreat, fleeing in panic from a force they had underestimated. Jalal ad-Din had done what no one thought possible. He had defeated a Mongol army in open battle. Thank you so much for watching this incredible piece of history with me. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more tales of legendary heroes. Jalal Adin's victory at Parwan was a thunderclap that echoed across the Islamic world. Can you imagine the sheer shock and disbelief? For the first time in years, the terrifying, seemingly invincible Mongol war machine had been stopped. Not just stopped, but defeated in open battle. News of this triumph spread like wildfire, igniting embers of hope in hearts that had long grown cold with fear. From the markets of Samarkand to the mosques of Baghdad, people began to whisper, maybe, just maybe, resistance was possible. Maybe the tide was finally turning. This wasn't just a military loss for the Mongols. It was a deep psychological wound. Their entire empire was built on a myth of invincibility, a reputation for unstoppable brutality. And now, a single prince, the leader of a supposedly dead empire, had shattered that myth. Jalal Adin, this forgotten prince, had done the impossible. He had stared into the abyss and made the abyss blink first. But as any student of history knows, when you poke a bear, you better be prepared for what comes next. And Jalal Adin had just poked the biggest, angriest bear on the planet, Genghis Khan himself. The victory at Parwan, as glorious as it was, came with a terrible, unforeseen cost. It was a symbolic act of defiance that struck at the very core of Mongol power. While Jalal Adin and his men celebrated their hard-won victory, they were basking in a fleeting moment of sunshine before an apocalyptic storm. They couldn't possibly know the fury they had just unleashed. This defeat wouldn't just be avenged, it would be answered with a level of ferocity that would make the previous invasions look like a minor skirmish. Genghis Khan was not a man who tolerated failure or defiance. He was personally taking charge of the campaign. Think about that for a second. The great Khan, the conqueror of half the known world, was now focusing the entire, terrifying weight of his empire on one man. The Mongol war machine, now shaken but far from broken, was retooling and refocusing with a single objective: to erase Jalal Adin from the face of the earth. Jalal Adin, despite his brilliance, his courage, and the loyalty of his men, was now in a desperate race against time. He had to consolidate his gains, gather more allies, and prepare for a counterattack of unimaginable scale. His greatest triumph had just set the stage for his most desperate struggle. As the news of Parwan spread, Jalal Adin became more than just a prince. He became a living legend, a symbol of hope against overwhelming odds. Across the vast territories conquered by the Mongols, From the dusty plains of Persia to the rugged mountains of Afghanistan, rebellions began to flare up. People who had been crushed under the Mongol heel now looked to Jalal Adin as their champion, their rallying point. He was the spark that was threatening to set the entire Mongol Empire ablaze. It was a beautiful, powerful idea that one man's courage could inspire millions. But Genghis Khan was no fool. He was a master tactician, a grand strategist, who understood power better than anyone. He saw these rebellions not as isolated fires, but as a systemic threat to his entire empire, all stemming from Jalal Adin's victory. He knew he couldn't let this narrative of successful resistance take root. So, he didn't respond with blind rage or a hasty counterattack. No, that was the mistake his general had made at Parwan. The Khan responded with cold, calculated, and terrifying precision. He understood that Jalal Adin, for all his battlefield genius, was still outnumbered, outsupplied, and ultimately vulnerable. Genghis Khan began preparing an army so massive, so overwhelming, that it would not just defeat Jalal Adin, but utterly annihilate him and the very idea of rebellion he represented. Meanwhile, Jalal Adin, buoyed by his success, was planning for the future. He was dreaming of reclaiming his father's lost empire, of building a new Khwarezmian kingdom from the ashes. He rallied his forces, trying to forge a united front from a coalition of disparate tribes and warriors. He was completely unaware of the sheer scale of the retribution that was thundering towards him. The Mongols weren't just regrouping, they were learning. Genghis Khan had studied the defeat, analyzed the mistakes, and was now preparing a campaign that would leave no room for error. By early 1222, the storm broke. Genghis Khan himself led the charge, unleashing a relentless pursuit across the treacherous terrain of Afghanistan. The Mongol horde moved with a speed and discipline that was simply inhuman. Every pass, every valley became a trap. With each passing day, Jalal Adin's options narrowed, and his chances of survival grew terrifyingly slim. His army, though fiercely loyal and hardened by battle, was a flickering candle against the Mongol hurricane. They were exhausted, constantly on the move, and hemorrhaging soldiers. They were no match for the Mongols' superior numbers, their brilliant logistics, and their unwavering discipline. The Mongols could march for days on end with minimal supplies, coordinate vast armies across huge distances, and fight with a singular, brutal purpose. Soon, Jalal Adin found himself pushed to the brink, cornered with his back against the mighty Indus River. It was here that he would face the most agonizing decision of his life. How do you fight an enemy that seems to have no weakness? How do you confront an empire that has already conquered the world and now wants only your head? His moment of glory at Parwan had led him directly to this final, desperate stand against the wrath of Genghis Khan. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible historical journey. If you're fascinated by tales of courage, strategy, and the clash of empires, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll witness the dramatic climax at the Battle of the Indus. We'd love to have you with us. In our last episode, the young Khwarezmian prince Jalal Adin had just dealt the Mongols a shocking defeat at the Battle of Parwan. It was a rare setback for the seemingly invincible empire, and it was one that Genghis Khan would not tolerate. The great Khan himself was now on the move, leading a massive army with a single, burning objective: to personally hunt down and eliminate Jalal Adin, the last ember of Khwarezmian resistance. The victory at Parwan had filled Jalal Adin with a surge of confidence, but that confidence was about to be tested against the full might of the Mongol war machine. Genghis Khan, a master of learning from his mistakes, knew he was facing a different kind of enemy. Jalal Adin wasn't a king hiding behind castle walls. He was a guerrilla fighter who knew the terrain like the back of his hand. So, Genghis Khan adapted his strategy. This wouldn't be a simple clash of armies. This would be a hunt. The Mongol approach was brutal in its efficiency. Instead of seeking a decisive battle right away, Genghis Khan's generals used overwhelming numbers and superior logistics to systematically dismantle Jalal Ad-Din's support network. They operated like a pack of wolves, herding their prey, cutting off supply lines, and closing every possible escape route. They understood that Jalal ad-Din's strength was his mobility, so they aimed to take that away from him, to leave him with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. The Mongol army was a marvel of organization. Their logistical train could sustain vast forces in the harshest environments, allowing them to pursue their enemies relentlessly. They wore down Jalal ad-Din's army, not just through combat, but through exhaustion and starvation. Every village that offered him aid was put to the torch. Every mountain pass he might use was blocked. The Mongols were turning his greatest advantage, his knowledge of the land, into a cage. Despite his tactical genius, Jalal Adin simply couldn't keep up. For every clever maneuver he made, the Mongols responded with overwhelming force. His army, once buoyed by victory, now found itself in a desperate retreat. Pushed further and further into the forbidding mountains of what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan. The young prince was no longer a conqueror. He was a fugitive. The once mighty Khwarezmian Empire was a ghost, its cities in ruins and its people scattered. Jalal ad-Din's soldiers, though fiercely loyal to their charismatic leader, were stretched to their absolute limit. They were exhausted, hungry, and their morale was cracking under the constant, suffocating pressure of the Mongol pursuit. Every sunrise brought the dust clouds of another Mongol column on the horizon. The weight of the entire Mongol Empire was pressing down on this one man and his dwindling band of followers. Jalal ad-Din, realizing the sheer scale of the threat he faced, knew that time was running out. He couldn't run forever. A final, decisive battle was inevitable. His last chance for survival, his last roll of the dice, would have to be one more stand against an empire that had already proven it could not be stopped. By the spring of 1221, the Mongol net had finally closed. Jalal ad-Din and his remaining forces were cornered, their backs against the mighty Indus River. He was faced with an impossible choice. He had fought with incredible tenacity, leading his men through unimaginable hardships, but the Mongol war machine was simply relentless. Genghis Khan's generals had expertly worn down his army, patiently and strategically, until this very moment. The final confrontation was at hand. The terrain was unforgiving, but this time, the Mongols were prepared. They had learned from their defeat at Parwan and were ready for Jalal ad-Din's tactics. They swarmed his position from all sides, a tide of horsemen and archers determined to finish the job. Jalal ad-Din's army, a fraction of its former size, exhausted and hopelessly outnumbered, could do little against the crushing Mongol assault. The battle was fierce, a testament to the loyalty Jalal ad-Din inspired, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. Even as his lines collapsed, Jalal ad-Din fought like a lion. He was always at the heart of the action, his sword cutting down Mongol soldiers, his voice roaring encouragement to his men to fight with every last ounce of their strength. But bravery alone cannot defeat an avalanche. The numbers were simply too great. As his forces were overwhelmed and the end became certain, Jalal ad-Din made a decision that would cement his name in legend. Rather than face the humiliation of capture or a meaningless death on the battlefield, he spurred his warhorse to the edge of a high cliff overlooking the Indus River. In a breathtaking act of defiance, he leaped. Horse and rider plunged into the raging waters below, choosing a heroic escape over surrender. It was such a dramatic and courageous act that even Genghis Khan, watching from a distance, was said to have been struck with admiration for his young enemy. As Jalal ad-Din surfaced and began swimming for the far bank, the great Khan reportedly ordered his archers to hold their fire. Genghis respected courage above all else, even in a foe who had caused him so much trouble. Jalal ad-Din, though wounded, survived the fall and made it to the other side. But his power was shattered. His army was gone, his empire was lost forever, and he was now a fugitive with no followers. The brief, shining moment of triumph at Parwan had been extinguished by the brutal reality of Mongol supremacy. For the next decade, Jalal ad-Din wandered through India and Persia, fighting small skirmishes and trying to rally support, but he would never again command a force capable of challenging the Mongols. He eventually died in 1231, assassinated in the mountains, a lonely end for a man who once held the fate of an empire in his hands. Yet, his legacy endured. In his defiant struggle, Jalal ad-Din had shown the world that even the Mongols were not gods. They could be beaten, they could be resisted, and in his legendary leap into the Indus, he created an immortal story of courage against impossible odds. Thank you so much for joining us for this chapter of the story. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next episode. We'll see you then.